Hello, and welcome to Language of the Soul, where life is story. I'm your host, author Dominick Domingo, and I would love to introduce the co creator of this podcast and our producer, Virginia Grenier.
Hi, how are you guys all doing? I'm glad to be here.
So, given that this is our first episode, our virgin episode, we figured we'd devote it not to just conveying the premise or spirit of the podcast, in other words, what we hope to impart with this dialogue, but we figured you deserve to know a little bit about us. If we're taking up your airspace, it's the least we could do. So I'm going to quickly not rattle off my resume, but I'll sort of try to give you a glimpse of what I've been up to for the past 55 years and how it led me to my book, Language of the Soul, which again, I will let Virginia speak for herself. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I believe the title of the book was the impetus for joining forces and birthing this podcast. So, in a nutshell, I was born with a paintbrush in my hand in Burbank, California in 1968 and spent a childhood surrounded by hippies at the Creative Arts Center. I'm really nostalgic these days about that moment in time. So, very creative household. I was encouraged every step of the way. I think I already said my first oil painting class at 7 at that very same Creative Arts Center. Got my first typewriter at 9. So clearly I identified as a storyteller to some degree because I wore out the typewriter immediately. I was told it should last me through college, but of course that was not the case. The E popped off almost immediately, and of course I developed a nice callus from the prong where the E went missing. But anyway, basically I slipped through the cracks in public school because although I was reading college level at 3rd grade, nobody really knew what to do with that. I call it, a shortcoming of the Burbank Unified School District, but I just was never encouraged in the academic realm. I was never told you need to take the PSATs or the SATs. So I excelled in all things creative, and I have no regrets. But I ended up at Art Center College of Design, and it turned out to be one of the top design schools in the world, unbeknownst to me at the time. So I fared very well, graduated with distinction. But somewhere in there, I had interned at Disney Feature Animation about halfway through school. So they offered me a job at the end of the internship, but I said, no, I'd like to go get my degree and, finish up. I had completion issues, and a lot of people thought I was crazy for not taking the job. But of course, it took a little hustling to get back in, but the job was sort of waiting for me upon graduation. Just took a little footwork. And I ended up starting on a small film to become known as Lion King. So, of course, it broke box office records and became one of the top grossing films of all time. So I stayed on for Pocahontas, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Tarzan, Little Match Girl, and One by One. I somehow smelled the call of the wild in there. I had written a screenplay and was just dying to make it. It was very personal. But it coincided with the falling of the axe. 300 artists were laid off in one day, and some of us read the writing on the wall and took the opportunity to jump ship, and others didn't. I chose to leave, like a lot of my colleagues. My mentor on Lion King and Tarzan both decided to indulge his gallery work, and he now shows in Tahiti and Hawaii, and I did the same. I jumped ship to make live-action films. So speeding things up here, I made several live-action films, none of which made me rich, but no regrets. I got my stories out into the world, won some awards in the festival circuit, garnered distribution for some of them. At one point, I looked down and said, that's called a writing resume. I have several original screenplay credits on SAG, IMDb films with distribution. That's something a lot of aspiring screenwriters would kill or die for. They come to LA with their 2-year plan or their 5-year plan, and I just stumbled into it. I figured storytelling is storytelling. As a self-professed writer-director or auteur, I just wrote the things in order to make them. But I did realize that writing resume is nothing to balk at. So I put my lifelong love of writing, as I mentioned, I got a typewriter at the age of 7. I put that on the front burner, started writing narrative nonfiction essays and performing them in spoken word events around LA. I even founded one. And then slowly I had a piece published here or there, mainly literary fiction and narrative nonfiction. And then in 2012, my young adult urban fantasy novel was published, and it turned into a trilogy. So again, for good or bad, I was encouraged by winning the occasional award and just being very well received and receiving acclaim. So I identify as an author 100%. And then somewhere in there, I started teaching at my alma mater art center. This really plays into the content of the book, but also the worldview that's going to inform this podcast. So founded the entertainment track at Art Center College of Design, my alma mater, and taught for 20 years. So all that classroom experience really informs my understanding of the creative process. The way I put it is I learned more about the creative process and different relationships with it and what I call the artistic journey at large by teaching. Way more so than I ever could have in a book. So I'm going to kind of wrap up my resume by saying when I was promoting The Nameless Prince, my young adult urban fantasy that launched in 2012, that's when I started pounding the pavement, and I did, for example, Book Expo America in Washington, D.C., a couple other stops, and I think our third stop was St. George Book Festival, the director of which was our producer, Virginia Grenier. So it's been going on 12 years that we've known one another. We've kept in touch, mostly in cyberspace. We've appeared on several talk radio shows together and podcasts. And most recently, I think it was Marcia Cook, Red River, correct me if I'm wrong, Virginia. You can tell me the exact name of the show, but I think it's Red River Radio or Michigan something or other. Anyway, we appeared on a show together and got the brainstorm to start up this podcast. And I'll let you speak to that, Virginia, if you don't mind. What about the title was seemingly very aligned with the work you're doing? I do believe you're in a master's program, but again, I don't want to butcher any details. So tell us about what you've been up to and how it led you to where you are today, which is, for good or bad, joining forces with me on this wonderful podcast.
So I'm currently in the application process, what's called the practicum of the master's program. So for psychology, so it's basically where you start doing your counseling therapy hours as to build up your time to become a licensed practicing therapist or counselor.
And that's different than an internship or a fellowship where one builds up hours?
Internships, fellowships are part of that, but it's called a practicum. And so it's where basically you build your hours because you have to have so many hours before you can test for your licensure and all that fun stuff. So yeah, so that's what I'm currently doing. And as of course, for our listeners, as Dominick mentioned, we've only known each other for about 12 years, even though it feels like we've pretty much the second we met, it was like we were old souls. I mean, we just kind of meshed really well, and so it was really.
I think it's the Utah connection.
maybe.
My family are from Utah.
Well, and I'm originally from the LA area.
Oh, that's course. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a lot of where our lives have never, except over the last 12 years, have intersected, but where we've constantly, I guess you could say, been ships passing in the night right. for many decades. So yeah, so I think that's probably why, because we have just so much commonality between each other. But so as you mentioned, of course, I was actually director of the St. George Book Festival, and I am also an author and did some editing. I had a children's magazine for a while, but my background when I was in LA was in marketing and in the fashion world. And then I ended up relocating to Southern Utah and got into public safety as a victim advocate. And that's what really sparked me to do what I always liked when I was younger, which I always found psychology interesting, to finally light a fire under my butt to actually jump into college again and go into actual psychology, become a mental health counselor. So I have a pretty diverse background.
Well, that was my observation early. I hinted at that. I wondered what the common thread, and I'm sure there is one. I'd just love to hear it from the horse's mouth. If there's an umbrella or a common thread throughout all those experiences that led you to where you're at, what is it? I love hearing you say it, though, that was it victims advocate that
Yeah, being a
how that
victim's
led to your interest in psychology?
It did, yeah.
Do you
And I
mind
mean,
my asking, what was it, a specific type of victim or just any and all? I mean,
no, I mean, so when I was in high school and even when I was in college for my merchandising and marketing background, I took psychology classes. I was always fascinated with psychology. And okay, sounds so terrible, but, and sure, I'm not the only one out there in the world who felt this way. There's two things I always wanted to be, because every kid wants to be something when they grow up, right? So I wanted to either be a marine biologist,
of
or I
course,
thought,
every little girl wants to be that.
right, because I want to go swim with the dolphins and the whales. Who doesn't?
Oh, okay.
And then the other thing, yeah, of course I thought I was a mermaid. And then the other thing, is I always liked psychology and understanding. I always thought it was fascinating, like why people do what they do. So that's why I took those psychology courses. And of course, it plays into marketing because there persuasion and all of that stuff falls into that. So I took psychology classes, loved them. And so I had thought about like, do I want to be a therapist? But then when I started so the two reasons why I didn't do those pathways is back I'm gonna in the dark ancient dinosaur time, because I'm that old. Marine biologists didn't make money. You had to basically sell yourself to anybody who would sponsor your research projects. So you had to whore yourself out, and then to become a therapist or a psychologist or a counselor, you had to spend anywhere from 6 to 10 years in college, and that was not my idea of fun. And that's why I didn't do those pathways. And then, of course, I moved to Utah, get into public safety, become a victim advocate, which you only need to have this, here in Utah, to do basic advocacy work as a community advocate, 40 hours. But then I went on and actually became a national certified victims advocate. So you needed more training hours, but it's only a certificate. So it doesn't take you a long time. It takes you like a year. And so I was like, I can do that. And then after working with people, I realized I do like understanding why people, and I was working at a police department. And so, of course, the whole forensic side of things came into play of like why people do the criminal behavior that they do. And so I was like, you know what, it's time for me to go back to school. So here I am in my 40s, back in college.
I really respect that. It's a wonderful. And you have how many kids?
I have 3.
Okay, yeah, you're a busy woman. It's very
two are out of the house. I just sent my second one, just graduated from high school, so I technically only have
the job
one
never
minor.
ends. You know
That's
that.
true.
The job never ends. It's impressive. I really love. I mean, to sort of tie it back into our podcast a little bit. There's a really great book called I Am Asher Lev. Have you ever heard of that?
I have not read that one, but I've heard it's good.
Yeah, I'm Potok, I think, if I'm not butchering it. Anyway, and I was always just really inspired by the mother character because she was always reinventing herself and just perpetually intellectually curious. And it was kind of haunting because I hate to say it, but my mom was kind of not. She's awesome, but in so many ways, so creative, but not necessarily like into the brain plasticity or the committed to intellectual curiosity. My parents are pretty low key, do you know what I mean? And they're not that, they're not adventurous spirits, and they certainly don't reinvent themselves.
Yeah, I've definitely reinvented myself a few times. Well, and that's the other thing too. I mean, I'm not surprised that I'm on this journey or pathway into psychology because as I said, I was a writer, and in writing,
right. Well, sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, you dive. I mean, that's the whole point. You want to have a multifaceted character. You have to understand the behaviorisms of why your character does what it does. And I'm a huge Stephen King fan. Everybody looks like I'm weird, but again, did you not hear the forensic psychology side? It's because hello, why do people do the weird things they do? And the whole nature versus nurture argument, which is pretty much all Stephen King's writing. And so and that's why when you came to me and asked me, hey, I'd like to, I have this new book out, I want you to talk about it. And so when I, did my quick, run through of Language of the Soul, I was like, oh my gosh, here we are. Everything.
Well, that's what I keyed in on. The common ground. Sorry if I'm interrupting.
No, you're fine.
Can pick back up in a second. But when I hinted that there seems to be a common thread there, it is indeed the one that, united or bonded us over the book and now the podcast. To me, you're kind of putting the cart after the horse a little bit by saying, I want to have fully fleshed out characters. I would argue that the thing that makes you a writer, and this is somewhat in the spirit of the book, is you are an observer of the human condition, right? You're an observer of not just behavior, and not just what makes people tick, but just the whole, to me, it's like, well, the meaning in life. We kind of connect dots, not everybody, but I think a lot of writers have something to say in the world, if that makes sense. And so that probably inclination to observe human behavior and try to glean something from it and make sense of it and then reiterate it might be what makes you a writer in the first place.
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you so much for letting us know a little bit about yourself. We definitely have a lot of shared sensibilities. I wanted to now give the folks, our listening audience, a little glimpse into what was the impetus for this podcast and maybe a glimpse of what kind of content we'll be offering moving forward, what we hope to impart through this dialogue, and what we hope to contribute to the dialectic. I guess I'll start with a little description of our mission statement, more or less, the concept and the premise of the podcast. So forgive me for reading, but it's probably the best way, the best way to stay on track. Virginia and I, we'd like to keep this light and accessible and conversational, but what that means is we often go on tangents, and they may have little or no entertainment value to anyone other than the two of us. So in order to stay on track, I'm just going to read the description we've come up with for the premise of the podcast. Enjoy. Based on Domingo's acclaimed book by the same name, Language of the Soul, podcast explores the infinite ways in which life, simply put, is story. Individually, we're all products of the stories we've been exposed to. Collectively, culture is the sum of its history. Our respective worldviews are little more than stories we tell about ourselves. Socialization is the amalgamation of narratives we weave about the human condition, shaping everything from the codes we live by to policy itself. Language of the Soul podcast spotlights master storytellers in the arts and entertainment. From cinema to the literary realm, it explores topical social issues through the lens of narrative, with an eye on the march toward human potential. And as always, a nudge to embrace the power of story in our lives. So that's the official blurb. We are going to try to impart some of the content of the book, and we have a really great list of upcoming episodes, topics, and guests. So I guess that's the way in which we're going to augment the content of the book is just some really stellar guests. I won't issue any spoilers or let the cat out of the bag, but some well-known storytellers that have actually impacted, in my opinion, popular culture, but what I call the noosphere, which refers to that invisible realm of, again, codes, morals, ethics, principles that we live by, many of which become policy, not just respective individual worldviews, but on the macro scale become policy. So, as a way to sort of dip a toe in future content, I'd like to just walk you through the chapter headings of my book. The podcast was inspired by the title of the book, and Virginia can speak more to that in just a minute. But basically, it's my life's work. During the pandemic, I had a creative explosion, like a lot of people. I think we all needed a reason to get up in the morning, and frankly, I call it a cultural timeout, during which a lot of people finally, got to buckle down and reflect. And in my case, midway through the pandemic, I was asked to offer an online series on story to a global audience, or listenership, I should say, through CTN, Creative Talent Network. Basically, Creative Talent Network has been around for about 12 to 15 years, but I think the convention, which is called CTNX, the largest animation convention in the world, has been around for about 12. And I've participated since its inception. Anyway, because of the pandemic, the normal convention could not take place, so we were trying to inspire artists and ourselves, right, and keep the dialogue going. So I was very glad to participate because I think during the pandemic, we all needed a reason to get up in the morning. And I think we artists needed to continue to remind one another why we do what we do. I think all humans kind of needed to reflect and take stock. So I jumped on the opportunity. I did, however, almost immediately hit a very familiar wall because I have a little resistance to really anything definitive in the creative process or anything in the arts. I really resist good, bad, right, and wrong. But more to the point, I just don't think we need another book about the nuts and bolts of technique. There are many of them out there. So keeping it short, I really just said yes, as long as I can talk about not again technique or craft or the nuts and bolts of craft, but why we tell stories in the first place. In other words, what I was passionate about imparting. So that's what it became, and I'm very proud of the workshop. It was very successful, but it was a lot of work getting my thoughts together, formulating, the weekly content. And so after it was over, I thought, I might as well make a book out of it. It became my life's work. So I didn't know it at the time, but of course it's a snapshot of my worldview and pretty much my entire 55 years on the planet, albeit under the umbrella of story. Reading through just the chapter headings might be a great way to give you a hint of what kind of content you can look forward to with the podcast. Again, knowing we're augmenting it with related guests on any given week, germane to the topic. So, keeping it real brief, I'll just walk you through the chapter titles of the book and a hopefully short synopsis of what the content of each chapter is. So, the first one is the introduction. Of course, as with this podcast, I figured if you're going to hang in there for 370 something pages, I think it is, you deserve to know whose worldview you're getting a glimpse of, or at least whose thoughts on story are being shared. So I kind of start with this anecdote of just being a weird 6-year-old that probably thought too much for his own good and was basically standing with my grandmother looking over the Owens River Valley in the Mojave Desert and contemplating life. I was, again, that odd 6-year-old that apparently had existential crises. So I said, Grandma, if we weren't here, and we were holding hands, by the way, if we weren't here, what would there be? So thinking back, I really apparently was innately aware that consciousness, right, was separate from our physical expression of it. And so on some level, it was as simple as, I guess I had heard about the concept of eternity or living forever, like it's said in the Bible. And I thought, number one, are we not going to be bored? What will we do the whole time? But I also just was having trouble wrapping my brain around it. So whatever it meant, I asked the question. And my grandmother, being a product of her generation, having lived through the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, really was not interested in the big questions. So her hand squeezed tighter around mine, and her guileless answer was, well, honey, just try not to think about it. So that's kind of the introduction of the book, as a kid that really thought too much, especially about existential matters, and how that, informed my adult life of storytelling. So I outline, the various genres and formats of storytelling that I feel very lucky to have been able to dabble in my entire adult life, and how it informs my views on storytelling. So after the introduction, chapter 1 is called Storytelling and Transformation. That might seem self-explanatory, but again, without going on too much about each chapter, it's really about the chemical basis of storytelling. So if it's true that we've been storytellers from day one, even arguably pre-language through our images, our cave paintings, but then certainly through oral tradition on, it arguably became the means by which we individually transform, and on the macro level, how our noosphere evolves. So I call it transformation on the individual level through catharsis, and then paradigm shift on the macro level, right, through this noosphere, this postulated sphere of ideas and principles and ethics, all of which not just inform policy, but drive social reform and social evolution. Arguably, the abstract ideas that are imparted only through metaphor, and metaphor is story. Way more on that, obviously. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is the creative process as catharsis. This goes into just all the different models of the creative process and what I've learned in 20 years of teaching, which is way more than I ever could have learned in a book. And also the lifelong artistic journey, I call it. Not just the creative process and different relationships with it, but the ongoing chemin artistique, it's called. The lifelong commitment to your artistic journey. Do not ask what kind of ambiguous Eastern European accent that was. All right, and I actually, when discussing catharsis, go back to Aristotle's original coining of the term, believe it or not. There was a moment not unlike this moment during which fascism threatened creative expression and freedom of expression. So his agenda was very much to shed light on the cultural value of storytelling, and that would be transformation, through his newly coined term, catharsis. So that's what that chapter is all about. And then number 3 is myth and archetype in modern storytelling. Again, might sound self-explanatory, but we kind of parse the gamut of archetype to stereotype to cliche. It goes into very much whether you believe in Jungian psychology or not, or subscribe to Thomas More and comparative religion notions. It really doesn't matter what you believe. It's way more comfortable nowadays to speak of tropes that are perpetuated through social conditioning rather than any sort of inborn reservoir of collective consciousness. Education has changed, and the words we're allowed to use have changed. But what I'm hoping to impart in that chapter is, as artists and storytellers, you're shooting yourself in the foot if you can't even use the word soul or soulful. But more importantly, it doesn't matter what your thoughts are on how these tropes, if you like to call them that, are perpetuated, whether, again, through this postulated reservoir called the collective unconscious, or through social conditioning alone and not cellular memory or anything to do with DNA. But bottom line is, it's the language we're speaking as storytellers. Better to get to know those archetypes than not, in order to empower the work. All right, and then chapter 4 is image and story. A picture is worth 1,000 words. The premise here is that word and image together very much comprise storytelling. There are a lot of modes that are very dialogue-free and reliant on nonverbal communication. Theater dell'arte is a great example. How it's just facial expressions, juxtapositions of images, and body language that really bypasses the intellect altogether and cuts through to the core of the human condition viscerally. So I really love that chapter. And actually, on that note, I'm going to read a little paragraph from that one because it is so relevant to this moment. This is all meant to give you a glimpse, again, of the content of the book and how it sort of will translate into our weekly topics here and our discussions. All right, so chapter 4, image and story. A picture is worth 1,000 words. We've all heard it said, we live in an image-saturated society. I cannot disagree. From the moment the quick editing of MTV began influencing commercials, news broadcasts, and magazine shows, it's been a steady arc toward utter bombardment, sensory overload. In 2022, that's when I wrote the book, by the way, if there are not at least 10 potential distractions on my computer screen or device, pop-up ads, clickbait, notifications, and tickers, I feel certain I've mistakenly wandered through a portal and returned to a simpler time, one with no notifications vying for my attention, complete with audio haptics, a time conspicuously devoid of African princes with money to launder, Russian brides, or horny housewives waiting for a click of my mouse. After being advertised to one too many times at a gas pump, I've heard myself swear the moment I'm president, unsolicited advertising will be the first thing to go. Most would agree that the incessant barrage of sensory stimuli has created a sort of cultural ADD. There are countless studies, indeed entire books, on the addictive nature of social media likes and the rush of swiping left or swiping right. As an artist who values stillness as the source of true inspiration, I have never fallen victim to the peptide addictions of technology or social media. Better put, I'm able to tune out the noise when I choose to. In fact, there came a time when I made a conscious choice to limit my intake of imagery. I was already exposed to visual art on a daily basis in my teaching. I had no desire to overdose like Lucy in the Chocolate Factory. I wanted imagery to maintain its power in my life. Fortunately, I am in little danger of becoming immune. The majority of content swirling about in popular culture and the Twitter sphere is vacuous, devoid of artistic substance. It's been created for the almighty dollar, not in response to inspiration from the universe itself. For that reason, the content lacks resonance and fails to steal my attention. When the cart of product is placed before the horse of inspiration, work will categorically be derivative, reductive. Powerful imagery will never lose its resonance for me because the very thing that infuses poetry or poignance, the very inspiration that affirms life, that elevates or transports, is missing in action most of the time. In its place, the impostor of titillation dominates social media and pop culture. The chances are slim I'll be moved or enlightened by Insta-models in yoga pants reaching for the lowest shelf in the refrigerator, or by shirtless men bench-pressing cats and cooking naked. Okay, hope you enjoyed that. So again, that was from the chapter titled Image and Story, and specifically the portion devoted to the fact that we live in an image-saturated society. The following chapter is called Finding Your Voice, Chapter 5. So that chapter starts out with a very famous quote from Maya Angelou. I might botch it, but I think there's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. So the chapter kind of goes on to just analyze the drive, the very innate, human drive, I would argue, we all possess, the drive to create, to leave a mark. That's covered in earlier chapters as well. But more specifically, it follows, again, what I called earlier the chemin artistique, the lifelong artistic journey, and the fact that those who have a discipline or a craft of any kind and take it seriously, they eventually find that it's not just a craft, it's being driven by a sense of purpose. So what does that arc look like? What does that journey look like? That of connecting one's craft with a sense of purpose and thereby contributing. Again, I've been using the word noosphere a lot, but another way of putting it is, what are we giving back to society? What are we giving back to collective consciousness, to humanity? There's a number of ways of putting it. But not everybody reaches that point. Some are content to put, roofs over heads and food on the table, and they may not have stories of their own to tell, but many, again, creatives in general, but specifically storytellers, really do discover over time what the hell it is they're doing on the planet, and they tend to connect that sense of purpose with their unique, authentic contribution. So it's a pretty great chapter because it not only gives permission for people to take the journey seriously and honor it and celebrate it, but it kind of just gives a bunch of examples of what that looks like. Okay, and then the final chapter, which is the zinger, is story and belief. So this might take some readers by surprise, thinking they're, again, getting a nuts and bolts of craft kind of book, but it's much, much larger than that. So without going into too much detail, that just really goes into one of the buzzwords in popular culture at the moment, this idea of manifestation. And from the ground up, it analyzes how our personal beliefs become our habits and our worldviews, and how those worldviews, create those lenses through which we see the world, which determine what manifests in our world, and then, by extension, what we manifest collectively as humankind. And at the moment, it seems we're falling pretty short of human potential. But it's really a call to action, this final chapter, to recognize the power of story in our lives, both the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the stories we collectively tell about ourselves, which becomes history, Nationalism is based on a cultural identity that may or may not be myth, entire myth, if that makes sense. So it's how we can transform our narratives and instead of beating old, tired drums, tell new stories, write our own songs, personally and collectively. So yeah, it ends with a pretty. It's not preachy. It's really not. It's just kind of, hey, let's take a look at this, and how can we empower ourselves and humankind by recognizing the immense role of story, both unexamined and examined. We're aware of some forms of storytelling, but some go under the radar as propaganda, right, or political campaigning, or just the status quo that, like fish breathing invisible water, we're completely unaware of. Okay, that's enough. That's kind of the premise of the book. And with that, I would love to pass the talking stick back to you, Virginia, and maybe you could share with our listeners some of the topics that we have planned and maybe even some of the guests.
Language of Soul, of course, is a podcast that delves into the transformative power of language, exploring how it shapes and influences the realms of writing, illustration, psychology, sociology, current events in society, and the LGBTQ plus topics. Our conversations take a contemplative and introspective approach, inviting listeners to reflect on the profound impact of language on personal growth, societal dynamics, and artistic expression. Through conversational discussions between, obviously, myself and Dominic, we're hoping to create a platform that explores the interplay between different disciplines and perspectives. Our goal is to share personal insights, observations, and experiences while inviting leaders, experts, creative individuals as guests to bring in that diverse viewpoint and expertise to our discussions. Our goal is to, of course, foster a place that is deep for exploration and empathy, and we seek to create an atmosphere of curiosity, introspection, understanding, allowing you, as our listeners, to engage with those profound ideas, challenging societal norms, and discovering the interconnectedness of our diverse human experiences. Our goal with each episode is to keep it conversational, organic, and authentic, and engage those conversations to that blended personal narrative and analysis of social issues, exploration of psychological and artistic elements, and engage, of course, with our current events.
I'm excited about what we can do here.
Right?
One thing I was tempted to jump in and say is that, I think you said something about the power of words in the literary realm, and I would just broaden that to say story, right? Word and image, that's a big premise of the book too, is word and image have a very different impact, but to me story is what we're really talking about, but also that the two are not mutually exclusive. Like putting on the sociology psychology hat is not altogether different than using sort of an artistic expression lens. That's the beauty. So
Yeah. Well,
that's just my little, yeah.
well, and that's going to be the next part. So I
Okay,
was going
go.
to, okay.
You go, girl.
Okay. So, our aim is to take you on a journey, challenge those assumptions, and embrace the transformative power of language in our own
Mm.
lives. Overall, Language of the Soul offers that invitation to embark on a soulful exploration of story and the spoken word, artistic expression, and the intricacies of society and our human psyche.
Love it. Beautiful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and again to jump in, we both are. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm a lover of the literary realm and filmed entertainment. But there's just so much crossover, right?
Oh,
And that's
yeah.
why when I went into my background, as I've told you, Virginia, it's like, believe it or not, I really resist talking about myself in my teaching. I have to force myself to do it because they deserve to know who's sitting in front of them. But I will say, regarding my background, the beauty of having worked in so many formats and genres, from film to entertainment to gaming to the literary realm and publishing to not just feature animation, but television animation, they all have different rules. So I
Mhm.
feel like we do touch the mind or the heart or the viscera, the gut, depending on the format we're talking about. Theater can be very cerebral, but in film, they say, show it, don't say it. It's a very feeling medium. So anyway, I just am excited about the crossover. And in fact, our guests are going to come from both the literary realm and filmed entertainment.
Yeah. So our guests will be from obviously from the literary realm. So there'll be writers, but we're also going to have people from the film industry, and we're going to have people who also come from more of the artistic expressional areas. And we may, of course, pop in a few experts on some other topics as well. Because when we talk about societal issues, obviously, we're going to want to talk to people who are in
Mm,
those realms when it comes
mm.
to activism and so forth. So yeah, it's going to be definitely about the creativity and the self-expression side.
Love it. Again, in my world, it's like there's just such a direct connection between, and that is the premise of the book, right? Like the
Hmm.
catharsis on the part of the artist or storyteller, the creative, there's a catharsis in the creative process. And then by extension, the patron hopefully goes through that very same transformation.
Right.
And then, as an extension, society benefits is one word.
Yeah.
Society sort of evolves as a result collectively. So I'm always going to be the guy, although I really, as I said to you a moment ago, really look forward to learning from our guests and just really taking in their perspective, whether it's, again, sociology, anthropology, or psychology, or even policy, right? I'm not a
Yeah.
political activist. I regularly said that's not my gift. Thank God. For thank God for people that are angry, right? And they go out there and protest. It's like that's never going to be me. I hope to make my difference through storytelling. I very earnestly say you change minds mostly by touching hearts. People dig in their heels when they're faced with persuasion, but if you can just open their hearts with a relatable story, they're going to be more receptive to agenda, right?
Well, and you think about it too, when it comes to our story. I mean, obviously, before we had the written language, people did do
Mm,
oral
mm,
storytelling, and the thing is that came from what? It came from their perspective of
mm,
what was current events going on around them at the time.
mhm.
So I really feel like society is affected by story, but story is also affected by society.
Mm.
Like they're very
Absolutely.
interconnected.
Yep, it's reciprocal, right? And well, in
Absolutely.
fact, it's so funny because literally in 1985, my first speech that I ever did for the Optimist Club oratorical contest, the topic was television, master or servant. And that was kind of, and even back then, there was a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death that really
Mm,
went into, and it's so out of control now, right? But it
right.
really kind of predicted where we would be headed.
Hmm.
It is reciprocal. And you can say, well, pop culture dictates, right, our policies. And then you can say, no, policy informs pop culture. It's reciprocal.
Yeah. Well, and it also makes me think about too when if you want to go more onto the nonfiction side of things too, everybody always talks about whoever is at the top of the chain when it comes to history. They're the ones who dictate what
Mm.
history is, but then sometimes is it because of how things played out in the past that that's how they got to the top of the chain, and that's why history is.
History is written by the winners, they say. I
So,
think this is related, but I don't, I'm a very, being an artist, it's like some numbers don't stick. And I so don't understand war, you know what I mean? That like
mm,
much of world history and US history just didn't stick because I don't even understand war in the first place. And you're supposed to memorize all these dates and battles. But as an adult, I remember thinking, okay, I'm very visual. So creating a chart where you take, oh, okay, in philosophy, sophism and personal liberty and individualism was really at the forefront. No wonder the French Revolution and the American Revolution took place at that same moment.
right.
So somehow I got all through school without ever learning philosophy, but I knew I would be inclined toward it. So I read a, let's call it Philosophy for Dummies book well in my 30s working at Disney. It was the first time history clicked because everything fell under the umbrella of philosophy. All world events were explained by the overriding philosophy on the planet at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. I mean, there is total interconnectedness. You don't have any one thing that you can point to at any certain time and say, well, this is why, because there's multiple whys. It just depends where you're standing at that vantage point to see what your why would be.
Yeah, and it gets problematic when you adopt, let's say, Hegel's dialectic, and you say, "Oh, history chews people up and spits them out because it was needed in our dialectic," right?
Hmm.
It gets problematic when you try to explain Hitler in that scenario, right?
Hmm.
But I do think with a lot of faith, you can actually see the value of all the pendulum swings, and this is a tricky moment too. Without
Yeah.
going too far out on a limb, it is related again to the, I think, the reason we're both excited about this podcast. When I started doing that summer workshop during the pandemic that resulted in my book, I started out by saying, yeah, this is a really divisive moment, right? And
Hmm.
I feel really compelled to diffuse some of the divisiveness with my gift. And my gift is actually seeing all sides of an issue, right? And recognizing the role of semantics and perspective, and that most of these divisive topics, especially faith versus science, which is ridiculous, they're not mutually exclusive with a little shift in perspective and a change in semantics, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So storytelling actually can bridge some of those divides to
Well,
bring it
and
full circle.
it does. And I think it also helps the mind understand what input it's taking in to make it more digestible, I guess.
It gives a
More
framework,
easily.
right? Like
Exactly.
I've always said, storytelling teaches you how to live in the world, not just Aesop's fables or Bible stories, things that are clearly didactic and prescriptive, but storytelling in general. And again, not even just children's books with an agenda. I think literature with artistic integrity and literary value actually makes a bigger difference than things that are propaganda by definition. Anyway, we don't need to talk about everything today.
Exactly. But yeah, no, you're right on the money. And so I think this is going to be an awesome thing to do because we're going to be taking so many different pieces, so many different perspectives, showing how it's all interconnected and circular, and really kind of letting everybody know that it all, like we said at the beginning, kind of breaks down to language. And I mean, that is the
Mm,
universal communication for
mhm.
everybody is language.
Yeah, I'm excited. And I think too, it's really easy today to feel just futile. It's like everything's over, it's a smaller planet than ever and feels kind of daunting and overwhelming because you can't solve all the world's problems. But having these dialogues, that's enough for me, contributing to the dialogue, if that makes sense. We all need a reason to get up in the morning, and it makes me feel purposeful to just be contributing to the conversation, I think it's enough to ask the questions, right? We don't need to
Mhm.
answer them all.
No,
Anyway, well, thank you. I'm excited.
I am too.
All right. I hope you guys join us, and that, if nothing else, even though we kind of just touched on a bunch of things and dropped them, that you'll be intrigued to join us in the future. And we have some great guests. I guess I'll just leave it at that. I'll dangle that carrot between Virginia's experience editing a children's magazine and then literally being the director of the St. George Book Fair. I know you have access to a lot of authors,
Mhm.
meaning storytellers, and you're probably a little more immersed in the publishing realm than I am. I just dip a toe in as an author and then make a quick exit. But I do have access to a lot of filmed entertainment, really master storytellers and geniuses and people I feel very fortunate to have been surrounded by my entire adult life. So, with that, I think we're going to wrap up by saying please join us for future episodes, if for no other reason than a little inspiration. Remember, life is story. And to mix metaphors, we can get our hands in the clay. Individually and collectively, we can write our own story. See you next time.